because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. So, the collapse of a belief system makes all the values within it no longer tenable. That's the meaning of Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. He said if you take the central axiom out of a system of belief, you can't hold on to all the things that were derived from that axiom. So here an example is this. So for example, in modern Western law there's a presupposition, and the presupposition is that in some weird sense everyone is equal before the law, and that's predicated on the idea that not even applies to someone who's a murderer. If you're a murderer and it's known, you have to be treated with respect. You have to be treated with respect by the legal system, and that's a very, very strange. It's a miracle that something like that ever emerged, because it's so unlikely. So then you might ask, well, what is the idea that everyone has worth before the law grounded in? Where does that idea come from? It comes from the idea of natural rights, that we have natural rights. And then you might ask, well, where did the idea of natural rights come from? Well, and then you're starting to move beyond the realm of rational philosophy, because natural rights, the idea of natural rights has been an idea that's been emerging for thousands and thousands of years. It's grounded in Christianity, at least it's grounded in Christianity to the degree that one of the things that distinguishes Christianity is the idea that there's a universal faith, and that everyone, whether they're in that faith or not, has intrinsic value. And so natural rights are grounded in the idea of the intrinsic value of the soul. And then that's grounded in the idea that consciousness itself participates in creation, and say that's an idea that's embedded in Genesis and also in most creation stories. So when you get rid of the religious underpinnings, which ground the entire system in a kind of dreamlike mythology, when you get rid of that, there's no reason that what's left over rationally can survive. And you can see that if you look at what happened in the 20th century, because there were at least two major challenges to the civilizations that evolved, and they weren't only Christian or Jewish civilizations. The same thing happened in China. There was a replacement of these evolved moral systems that emerged over a tremendous amount of time that no one rationally created. Once people started to criticize them and to destroy the axioms on which they were built and move them aside, then there was a gaping hole left. And the hole was filled, well, it was filled most particularly either by Nazism, which spread like mad throughout Central Europe, or by communism, which still possesses China. So, even though China came from a historical culture that was substantially different from, say, that of Western Europe, once rationality emerged to the point where it could be used as a critical force, which happened in Europe, that spread like mad, and it undermined the societies of China, just like it undermined the societies of the West. I mean, Russia, you can read this if you read Tolstoy, for example. In Tolstoy's Confessions, Russia was really the last country that underwent the transformations that were associated with the Enlightenment. So when Tolstoy was a young person in the late 19th century, he said he could literally remember when the announcement spread through his school that God was dead. Now, the Western Europeans had been working on that idea for a couple of hundred years, with the dawn of scientific thinking. But the Russians were very backwards in some sense, and they were never affected by the conflict between rationality and religion until it happened all at once. And it happened all at once at the end of the 19th century. And the consequence of that, it's complicated, but the consequence of that was that the monarchy exploded, and then the consequence of that was that the Russians were left with nothing, and the consequence of that was the Bolshevik Revolution. And then that was what started the entire Soviet nightmare. You see very frequently that when a society loses its grounding, say in its historical truths, that it turns to something as an alternative. You see the same thing happened in Quebec, because Quebec didn't undergo the modern transformation until the late 1950s. It was probably the last European society to to go through the Enlightenment revolution, because the Catholic Church was an incredibly dominant force in Catholic Quebec until the late 1950s. I mean, the average family size during that time must have been in the neighborhood of 10 children. And then all of a sudden, in the late 1950s, the Quebecers just lost their Catholicism. It was just gone. And now, for example, the Quebecois have the lowest marriage rate in the Western world, and one of the lowest reproduction rates as well. And there was a Gallup poll that was conducted. I heard about this must be 10 years ago now. I don't know if this information has ever been made public, but there was a Gallup poll that indicated that if you were a Catholic who had lost your faith, so you left the church, you were 10 times more likely to be a separatist. So you can see the consequence of it is that if one belief system disappears, well, nihilism is one possibility, but another possibility is that you just adopt the next thing that's close that gives you structure. And nationalism, of course, is one of those things. So Nietzsche diagnosed the disease, fundamentally. And then the psychoanalysts, like Jung in particular, they were trying to see, Nietzsche believed that if God died, because God died, people were going to have to take on the responsibility that was once God's, so to speak, as a personal problem. So, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche said, God is dead and we have killed him and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. But he also said, in order for people to withstand that catastrophe, they would have to become gods themselves, essentially. And, well, you can see how that might go wrong if you think about people like Stalin and Hitler. But the psychoanalysts also, like the psychoanalysts, especially Jung, and then Heidegger for his part, took that idea seriously. And Jung was trying to figure out, well, if we lose our historically conditioned values, we no longer believe in them, and if nihilism is the outcome on one hand and totalitarianism is the outcome on the other hand, what's left? And the Jungian idea was, well, the revelation of the self is that the individual could, not as a rational mind, but the individual as a totality, it's something that Rogers also believed, the individual as a totality would be capable of bringing forth genuine values as a consequence of self-exploration and honesty, something like that. And that's associated with the existential idea of individual responsibility. So one of the upshots of the Jungian theory is that to the degree you don't bear the responsibility for your own actions, to the degree that you avoid responsibility or shunt them off onto, say, totalitarian or ideological systems, so when you avoid responsibility for your own thought, because if you're the follower of an ideological system, you have avoided the responsibility of thinking for yourself. And the consequence of that was continual catastrophe as those pathological rational systems unfolded themselves.